1 year ago, Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine after months of speculation, starting what Moscow referred to as a special military operation that many predicted would lead to the fall of Ukraine. But with a strong resistance and, to paraphrase the Beatles, a lot of help from its Western friends, Kiev is yet to fall. Russia has made several strategic gains in the east, notably in the regions of Lugansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson and Donetsk. However, with little progress, changing motives for the operation and thousands of lives lost, Russian President Vladimir Putin is at a crossroads. On the Ukrainian side, a heavy PR campaign from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has won the hearts and minds of the West, but at a cost at both ends. Thousands of Ukrainians have been killed or displaced, whilst Western sanctions on Russia have exacerbated the global cost of living crisis. And approaching the 1-year anniversary, Vladimir Putin has pulled out of the nuclear arms treaty with the US amid talks of a new offensive. Is this a bluff, or are we heading towards a nuclear Armageddon? How long will Ukraine get almost unconditional Western backing for? Will Ukraine be able to survive a new Russian offensive, or have the Russians run out of steam? Who will win the battle of the wits, Vladimir Putin or Volodymyr Zelensky? And, with 1 year of hindsight, what's next in the Russia-Ukraine war?
Okay, gentlemen, let's get to it. As always, we begin with our quick fire round, 30 seconds each to lay out your initial stance on the matter, and we'll pick it up from there. What's next in the Russia-Ukraine war? Peter Zalmayev, please take the lead.
Well, yeah, the West does understand that there is a very psychological factor of fatigue. These are electoral democracies, and electorates, obviously are watching closely and demanding from the leaders accountability, how their money is spent. And so that's why, it's rushing ever greater quantities of sophisticated weaponry to Ukraine, so Ukraine can stage a successful counteroffensive sometime before the summer to win back as much territory as possible, and only then offer to the Russians to sit down and negotiate on Ukraine's terms.
Michael Tracey, your take.
Well, at the Munich Security Conference a few days ago, the sense one gets from talking to participants is that, if anything, the ideological fervor with which the so-called West, at least in the form of its security establishment, views this conflict has intensified and hardened to the point that they have imbued the conflict with such cosmic apocalyptic significance that there's really no reason to believe, at least as I can tell, that there will be any change in the course now, and that course is toward ever increasing escalation.
Last but not least, Dan Perry, your take?
The surprising thing to me is how little has changed in the fundamental narrative in the year that has passed. And it also is testament to dictatorship's inability to walk away from a terrible mistake. I have to say, I would expect in coming months for Russia to continue to try to make improvements to its position on the front, and then at some point maybe declare victory, and the pressure will be on Ukraine whether they accept such a thing or not. I don't know if the West will forever support Ukraine's willingness to fight on.
And let's begin from that point exactly, and obviously let's feel free to interact from this point onwards. I keep circling back to this question in our Ukraine debates or conversations because personally I find it as fundamental. The West is vowing to stand by Ukraine until the end, but the definition of end, is Ukraine's end the same one as the West's end? Michael?
Well, the United States has long had this mantra, meaning that, or the Biden administration, when addressing this question, has long said, and they're repeating it with even more gusto now, that it's up to Ukraine to decide what the strategic victory that they're pursuing looks like. And of course, this is just a feint, because it's the United States that is single-handedly, or nearly single-handedly, subsidizing the very existence of Ukraine as a state at the moment. The United States is intensely involved, not just in the provision of weaponry, but in the operational effectuation of the combat mission that Ukraine is undertaking. So, of course, it's the United States that wields the power to decide what so-called victory would look like, but makes it seem like it's deferring to the agency of Ukraine, at least in its public statements, to kind of give the U.S. interventionist policy here a more sort of self-glorifying gloss. So what does it look like? Well, it comes down to the prerogatives of the United States. Fundamentally, you could talk about the resourcefulness and the valor of the Ukraine fighters all you'd like, and not to deny that that's exists. But in terms of the power dynamic, it's really what the U.S. determines is going to be the final course here. And Biden, if anything, has doubled down dramatically with his trip this week and so forth to Kiev.
Remember that Ukraine's official position is that they want the restoration of not just the areas lost in the past year, but also Crimea. I don't know whether America truly is as determined as public statements would suggest. I have to think that at the end of the day, if Russia sued for peace, they would find an interlocutor. I realize that sounds insufficiently determined to back Ukraine for some people's taste, but I think at some point, given the tremendous cost in treasure and in lives and in the strategic position of both sides here, that there will at some point come a moment where some optimal outcome might appear to not involve a return of all the areas captured by Russia.
Peter.
Yeah, let me just say that this was Henry Kissinger's formula after at first coming out with what seemed to Ukrainians as pro-Russian statements, very realpolitik statements. Henry Kissinger kind of backtracked. He talked about Ukraine being a de facto member of NATO, or should be a member of NATO at some point. It's a done deal. And then he said we should probably negotiate on the parts of Donbass and Crimea that were occupied in 2014-15. But that's the problem. You see, even though the Ukrainians have staked out this maximalist positions, all the borders, to the 1991 level. Let's say if we were to retreat to the pre-February 24th borders, would that satisfy Putin after thousands of sanctions, after hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded, for him to turn around and say, well, we went back to where we started and lost all this money and manpower and destroyed our army, and our reputation is in the tank. You see, it would not. That's why we are at a dead point, because it would.
I'm not predicting that Putin would accept that.
He has not given up on his.
I'm saying
he's not given up on his maximalist. It's not about territory so much about him. He wants to have Ukraine destroyed or subjugated. That's it.
Well, if indeed that is the goal, then I would expect sometime in 2013 to see a renewed attempt to take Kiev. And maybe, of course, nuclear threats and various types of escalation. I'm not sure. Remember that Putin is a dictator. He controls the discourse largely in Russia, not just through the cowed media, but also through social media. And I have some faith in Putin's ability to use his spin machine to claim victory, even where no victory is realistically to be found.
Well, before we try to
also, if I could add something.
Please, Michael.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, if there's any evidence that I'm unaware of that the United States, at least in the form of the president, the Secretary of State, top-ranking members of Congress, that they don't actually believe in the maximalist kind of ideological commitment that they at least avow in regard to Ukraine and the American resource investment too, please let me know, because at this point, one can really only take Joe Biden, for example, at his word when he casts the conflict as this grand, cosmic showdown between good and evil, freedom and autocracy.
But it can be, Michael. It can be that.
So, I mean, do you have any reason to believe that Joe Biden is not being honest when he's casting the conflict in such stark terms? I don't have that evidence.
I think at the same time, you can see this as a conflict between good and evil and between dictatorship and democracy and other things that are holistic, while being prepared to consider realpolitik outcomes that are, as I said, optimal. I do not take Joe Biden at his word. I don't take any politicians at their word. I certainly don't take people involved in a war situation literally when they make speeches that are clearly posturing. I think ultimately, people are more flexible than you give them credit for.
Well,
and also, by the way, anyone who knows, anyone who knows history, anyone who knows history is aware of the fact that the internal borders of the Soviet Union were largely a fiction and were designed to create chaos and to create untenable minorities in countries that would then become difficult to keep together. If I were Ukraine, I wouldn't necessarily want all those areas, in fact. And if in return I'm getting EU membership, de facto NATO membership, and a tremendous embrace from the democratic world, while Russia remains probably mired in poverty and isolation for the foreseeable future, I might be thinking I won the war.
Great point. Let me just say, but that's precisely what Putin is afraid of.
He hasn't wavered in.
Wait, gentlemen, we wanna hear both of you.
Alternative to Russia.
Okay.
Joe Biden for decades has been an ideologue on this issue in particular. You can go back to the 90s and the early 2000s where he was designated by both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush to shepherd through NATO expansion in the Senate. It's not a matter of taking him at his word. It's a matter of having insufficient evidence that he's actually insincere in his stated ideological investment in this conflict, which is now congealed into popular consensus. So unless there's any indication that's empirically accessible that Biden actually is taking on this practical, realist approach to the conflict rather than this grand maximalist ideological one, then the only rational thing to do is to just assume that he's actually
my empirical, Michael.
Let me just add one thing. At the Munich Security Conference, there was a renewed push that's not getting sufficient attention toward at least pursuing regime change in Russia as an ultimate aspiration. Not that every country is going to put out a formal policy decree demanding that Putin be ousted from power. But if you actually understand what the necessary implications are of the rhetoric that's being espoused, regime change is most certainly on the menu. They had a panel at the Munich Security Conference in lieu of any Russian officials whom they formally disinvited.
They
had these so-called Russian dissidents who are overtly calling for regime change and welcoming that.
The West would love regime change.
I was at that panel. Why would you call them so cold?
Existential stakes of the conflict.
Why would you call them so cold? They're dissidents.
Competing parties.
Yes,
may I just answer, Michael? Ellie, just 1 second.
Please.
My empirical evidence is the entirety of history that shows the politicians' posture. I think we would have to be very, very naive to take them all at their word. That's all.
Okay, on that note, Peter, can I wrap it up for us as we are soon taking a break?
Yeah, I was just saying, I mean, I was at that Munich Security Conference and I heard those people. I do not consider them so-called dissidents. I mean, if you spend 10 years in jail, in a penal colony in Siberia, like Khodorkovsky, you would not be calling someone else like that a so-called one. And I'm really glad you, sir, never had to experience that, but I don't understand the cynicism.
Okay, on that note, gentlemen, hold your thought right there. We are taking a very quick break, but when we get back, we continue our discussion. Are we nearing nuclear Armageddon, God forbid? A few minutes break, and we're back with the summit. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Dan Perry, Michael Tracey, and Peter Zalmayev. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for staying with us. We're also, of course, staying on topic. But first, let's take a listen to perhaps the only man who can actually bring an end to it all, or perhaps trigger a new beginning, Vladimir Putin. Let's take a listen.
In the beginning of February this year, there was a statement from NATO demanding that Russia returns to the Strategic Arms Treaty, as they call it, including allowing inspections of our nuclear defense facilities. I don't even know what to call it. It's a theater of the absurd. They can't be stupid people. They want to deliver us a strategic defeat while sneaking into our strategic nuclear objects. Regarding this, I have to say that Russia suspends its participation in the New START Treaty. Let me repeat, Russia does not want to abandon the treaty, but suspends its participation. Before resuming the discussion about this treaty, we must first understand what do such countries of the NATO alliance as France and Great Britain aspire to, and how will we take their strategic nuclear arsenals into account.
Okay, are we heading towards a nuclear Armageddon, or is Putin just bluffing? Another quick fire round, 30 seconds each, and we'll pick it up from there. Michael Tracey, your 30 seconds are on, please.
Well, in announcing that Russia would be suspending its participation in the New START Treaty, what happened was basically the obliteration of Barack Obama's chief foreign policy accomplishment from his first term when this treaty was enacted in 2010. Joe Biden was the vice president. And so it's come full circle where Joe Biden is presiding over that historic downturn in relations that Obama was trying to ameliorate and was celebrated for doing so at the time.
Dan Perry?
Putin became the first leader of the nuclear age to violate the idea that you don't actually threaten nuclear war. So I would take him at his word in this case. Look, the Armageddon scenario is if Putin decides to end the war, Ukraine refuses, and then he tries to make a point by either threatening to use nuclear weapons or maybe carrying out that threat, maybe in some limited form. And then, if the U.S. or the West responds and that escalates, we may be looking at the end of days.
So a few stages away from full-on Armageddon. Peter Zalmayev, your take?
I think Vladimir Putin's speech showed complete bankruptcy of ideas. He offered nothing new. It's once again, we're seeing it's a war of the archaic against the modern. It's, he wants to continue living in the year 2022, and his this nuclear posturing in the form of abandoning this treaty, well, it has no substance because Russia has for a while now not been adhering to this treaty. And this is part of his strategy to continue to blackmail Ukraine and its Western supporters with nuclear rhetoric.
Okay, gentlemen, let's feel free to interact. No doubt that it was a year full of miscalculations from Putin's standpoint, but nonetheless also from the Western standpoint. Should the West revisit its approach vis-a-vis Putin? Peter?
Well, I mean, I think not for lack of trying. I mean, the West has reached out to Putin up until the last moment. In the weeks leading to the war, it's, I think, a fool's errand to try to, wring hands and think what went wrong and what did we do, what didn't we do, and like why did we allow NATO to expand? That's another very spurious contention. By the way, I had a professor of mine at Columbia University who was the last ambassador of the U.S. in Russia, Jack Matlock, and he never corroborated that there was promise made to Putin not to expand NATO, first of all. So false premises, and therefore I consider Vladimir Putin's decision to go to war in Ukraine, a part of his plan that was made a long time ago. Once again, Vladimir Putin has run out of constructive ideas for the development of his society. He is now resorted to this Soviet-era nostalgic rhetoric. He wants to rebuild the empire, and there's very limited cooperation and understanding to be had with this player. I think the only we're heading down this road of Russia's complete isolation. Russia is falling into the hands of China. China will make mincemeat of Russia, and that will be actually good karma. This is exactly what Vladimir Putin and his supporters have deserved.
Dan,
I see no reason why the West should reevaluate its attitude towards Putin. At this point, there's not that much to be done, and the past war, other than a terrible cost wrought upon Ukraine, obviously, has not been unsuccessful from the point of view of the West. Consider how badly Russia has been hobbled. It is no longer able to wield energy blackmail upon the West. It is no longer considered a good faith player in the world economy and in diplomacy. Its military has lost any semblance of deterrence and even of a sense of competence. Russia is going to be impoverished and isolated, as I say, for a long, long time because of Putin. Dictators seem invulnerable and omnipotent until suddenly they're not. Like bankruptcies, collapse of dictatorial regimes happens slowly and then quickly. I wouldn't be surprised.
It's hard to believe that anyone could say that we may be approaching the end of days. That was, I think, the term used. And then not think that might be occasion to maybe reevaluate what led to this scenario. I don't know. I think maybe if you're on the precipice of apocalypse, you might want to give a bit of a rethink as to what brought you to that point.
By the way, I do.
Hold on, but there's no appetite for that at all.
Michael, let me respond, since I believe I'm the one you are putting to ridicule here. I understand that we are at a terrible precipice.
Mindset in making that statement, I would say.
In fact, I'm one of the few people who actually wrote prominently and publicly that the expansion of NATO may have been a mistake. I understand that there's some dispute over whether it was promised or not promised to Yeltsin that this wouldn't happen. But I never saw that much of a reason to expand NATO, especially because membership is a less profound thing than many people think. I understand Article 5 says an attack on one is an attack on all, but it doesn't say what you do. Ukraine is being defended much as it would have been were it a member of NATO.
Right.
It hardly makes a difference.
Michael, yes,
so to expand NATO formally
Dan, let's allow Michael.
to poke a finger in the eye of Russia.
Michael.
And that may have indeed been a mistake.
I mean, let's set aside the issue of NATO expansion, which I wasn't even really referencing there, and that's more just a historical context that you could or could not choose to focus on.
Okay.
Even just the manner in which the U.S./the West has approached the war for the past year. At the beginning, we were told, or it was at least given the impression, when Biden and others would describe the nature of the interventionist policy that would be undertaking in Ukraine, that it would be a limited sort of humanitarian, almost aid mission, send a couple of small arms and Javelin missiles, and that was about it. Fast forward a year later, somehow squadrons of battle tanks and potentially fighter jets and Patriot batteries and furnishing Ukraine an entirely new military. Now that's the objective, because what happened? Well, there was this incremental escalation in the Russian behavior in Ukraine, that's indisputable, but also in turn, the U.S. approach.
So,
what are you implying?
Would you have sold out Ukraine? Would you have sold them out and not defended?
The omen of a potential nuclear exchange draws closer and closer. So if you don't think that the United States or Western policy bears any responsibility for the actual conduct of the warfare that has gotten to the point where some sort of end time scenario might be on the offing, I don't think you just have a realistic understanding of how the trajectory.
Point made. Peter, we don't have much time. Peter, please wrap it up for us.
I just want to wrap it up like the NATO expansion and other security issues that Russia has claimed were part and parcel of his decision to go into Ukraine. Okay, well, Vladimir Putin is the one that's bringing about insecurity to Russia. All of a sudden, Finland and Sweden about to become members of NATO. If Putin cared about NATO so much, then he wouldn't have gone into Ukraine and caused these countries to feel insecure enough to enter into NATO. What was preventing Russia from living good, high on the hog, making billions of dollars from oil before he invaded Ukraine? Nothing. It was living great. Ukraine was not getting accepted into NATO for years and years. Neither was Georgia. All of a sudden, all of that has changed. And who is at fault for that? Vladimir Putin. Let's not be hostage to any kind of Stockholm syndrome and second guess. There's a perpetrator and there's a victim here. It's black and white.
If you look at this, if you look at this from altitude, I would have to say that at a time when democracies are on the defensive around the world, Putin has provided stark illustration of the danger.
The weakening case of liberal democracies was definitely saved by Vladimir Putin. We will give him that, no doubt. Michael Tracey, Peter Zalmayev, Dan Perry, let's hope there will not be year 2 anniversary. It seems that we're at some sort of a convenient, quote-unquote, managing the conflict state of mind here. Thank you so very much for this.